So these are a few of my favorite things. And I also see from the audience that there are many of my favorite people out there, including two that are showing up on the screen, Mike and Tony. So I hope that we enjoy our time together, and I hope the video stuff works. So 50 years of LAEL is something definitely to celebrate. And just to sort of contextualize this, I thought it might be fun to kind of look at a brief history of language instruction for 50 years and how it has also evolved, as I'm sure that the LAEL curriculum has evolved, much like our at NAU has evolved. And although we don't have 50 years, we'll get there. So here's how a lot of language instruction started. Grammar translation. There's several things wrong with this picture, obviously. One is the idea of teaching in a language classroom that has so many students. And I know there are many of you doing this, and I applaud you. But I have to say that it's, why does my internet? Okay, sorry. So the students are not engaged. And grammar translation has many good points. There are many good things about it, but if you want to use language to communicate, you can't. So then we sort of said, okay, we need to, in the 60s, we had the behaviorist method and Skinner and audiolingual method where the goal was perfection. We want error-free language production, and we're going to learn patterns, and we're going to practice, practice, practice. And that's important. And it resulted in a lot of people being able to learn a language, but it didn't allow us to be able to respond spontaneously. So then we said, okay, the big idea about language is we got to communicate. That's what it's all about. And so we focused just on that. And who cares about errors? We don't have to be perfect. We just want to communicate. And that can work really well. If you want to travel, you can communicate, and it doesn't really matter whether you're grammatically correct or not. And I think all of us have probably traveled somewhere where we've done the point and method. And that's great, but it won't work if you want to be in an academic context. So our evolution of teaching and our teaching goals have continued to evolve over 50 plus years. And now we're at a point where we realize, wow, we use language for lots of different purposes and in lots of different contexts. And we need to be able to do different things. Talking to friends, talking to a professor, writing for a grocery list versus writing an academic paper. These are all very different contexts of language use. And so that's one of the things I want to focus on. So the goals of the presentation that I have are, I want to show how vocabulary and grammar and writing all work together. And of course, it also involves listening, speaking, reading, right? You can't just do these things in silos. I really want to connect classroom teaching to real world contexts and real world needs. As teachers, people, I guess I can't make this generalization, but I think in most cases, people don't just say, oh, I think I'm going to learn language X because that seems like a fun language. We usually learn a language because we have a functional need to use that language, and we have a context in which we're going to use it. And I also really want to highlight the importance of register. And by register, I mean the situation of language use, the purpose of using the language, the mode, who we're, so is it spoken, is it written, is it in real time, has it been practiced? Who are you talking to? Are those people people who, there's probably some of you who were on this presentation when it was live streaming earlier, heard Mike and Tony and I talking, and some of that might have been pretty vague. We were talking about a bat. What does a bat, was it a bat an animal or a bat an object? And if you don't have that context, you don't know. And it's because we're friends and we share some common knowledge. Also Tony's sweatshirt. We don't share Tony's sweatshirt. We have that sweatshirt as an NAU gift. So back to the goals, sorry. We also want to look at chunks of language. So Throughout this presentation, I hope to weave ideas for activities and teaching ideas for this, and I will try to be a little bit more linear in my presentation. So, the importance of register. I think that this is something that we as language users have an awareness of, but sometimes as language teachers, we're not as aware of it. And so I want to talk a little bit about how we as teachers and preparers of our learners, we can help make this more visible. So we often in our methods classes talk about needs assessment and all that. And that's well and good, and it's important. But I think we sometimes don't get down to the nitty-gritty as to exactly what students will be doing, and then thinking about what's needed. And I'm not talking about, okay, they need present tense, or I'm going to have them practice sentences. Yes, sentences are important, words are important, but the context of how this all works is important. And I want to show you an idea, an example of being able to identify grammar demands or grammar needs to be able to deal with different texts. So as you can see here, I've put two kind of ends of a continuum here. I've got a written informational report, and I've got conversation between two friends. And I've put at the top columns of purpose, structure, and then major language features. And this is something that I think as teachers, this is something we can do with whatever we're looking at as far as lessons for students. And we can think about what's the purpose of this task? What's the structure? What's involved in doing this? And then what are some of the language features that we need to be able, what are the linguistic resources we need to be able to accomplish these language tasks? And just looking at this example, we can see that, you know, the written informational report, it focuses on information, but conversation between friends is interpersonal. And it might be also sharing some information, but the information is typically interpersonal information, not, you know, what temperature does water freeze at, or, you know, what is the photosynthesis properties of certain plants. So I think it's really important to have this awareness and think about the linguistic resources. I'm going to give you a second example of register, of the importance of register. And I'm going to ask you, although I can't look right now, or else it'll get really sideways, I'm going to ask you to look at this verb, make, and to think of some examples that use this verb. So think of some sentences, think of some expressions that you would say with this verb. And let's see, if I'm really clever, I should be able to see. I'm not, anyway. Okay, questions. The chat, okay, I can't. We're just gonna pretend you have these and you'll do what you do with it. So how many of you had things like make the bed, make a decision, make a living? Probably many of you had this. And these are really typical functions of make in conversation. And we know this for research, but when we look at something as simple as this verb make, and look at it in a different register, if we look at it in academic writing, we see that make is not as normally used to describe concrete actions. It's to describe mental activities or to refer to other information, or you make predictions, you make recommendations, you make assumptions, you make decisions, you make comparisons. So even with something as simple as this little verb make, we might teach it at a beginning level, but then we have to come back and revisit it to realize that we can't stay at that sort of concrete level. It functions differently. And I think this is really important for us as we teach and as we think about the really strong impact of register. Now, I know Viviana's in this presentation, and I know that she specializes in chunks of language. And there's others of you out there too, I'm sure, specialize in chunks of language. And this is one of my favorite things. So I want us to think about, as we teach, we often, well, I don't know if we often do it, but we many times teach words in isolation. And this is something we're going to look at. So think about adjectives. Think about common adjectives. And as you do this, think about when you're teaching vocabulary to your students, how often you teach adjectives in isolation. But if I were to say, I want you to finish this next part of this sentence, if I say, I'm afraid, most of you would probably say of, I'm afraid of. And that's what I want to show, that there are some common adjectives that have really common collocations or words that go together, baby chunks of language, that you can see here that we have, you know, I'm familiar with, I'm good at, I'm interested in. Let's teach these together so that our students have this. And I think most of us who learn English realize that these prepositions are really hard. They're really problematic. And so let's give our students, our learners, as much context for, and as much pairings of these that are kind of safe pairings, if you will. Also look at patterns of use. In writing, we often write cause and effect. So we know that nouns that are really common are cause, obviously, cause and effect, reason and factor. And we can also talk about adjectives that frequently go with those. So you can see here how we take something that we know as a teacher that we want to teach, but we put it in a context and we put these language pieces together. We want them to be building blocks. We want our students to have these resources available to them. And this is not to say that these are the only adjectives that go with these words. So don't leave here saying, oh, Randi said you can only use these 5 or 6 adjectives with reason. That's not true, but those are very common ones. So let's make sure that our students know those and that they also can use those, because they will be meeting them when they read and they will be using them when they speak. So moving on to chunks of language that go beyond just a 2-word pair. These things have many names, excuse me. Multi-word units, formulaic sequences, clusters. Some of you who have been teaching English for a long time might remember gambits. It was sort of these chunks of language that we had. I see Mike Scott nodding his head. And that was very popular. And also lexical bundles. And, excuse me, lexical bundles is what I want to focus on. And I want to make the point that this is a specific term. So it's not a general term. It's a term that has a definition. It means that 3 or more words are found frequently occurring in more than one text. So meaning that it's not idiosyncratic and it's not crossing punctuation or turn boundaries. So you might say, well, that eliminates blah, blah, and blah, blah. Okay, well, it does eliminate that, but this is the definition that I'm using and that I'm going to show you some examples of and some ways that we can incorporate this in our language classrooms. I also want to point out that these are not idioms. So it's not things like kick the bucket and it's raining cats and dogs. Things that we often spend a lot of time teaching in our language classrooms, but those of you who are native speakers of English, I want you to think, how many times outside your language classroom have you ever said, oh my, it's raining cats and dogs? Probably not that often, unless you're being funny. So here are some examples of some spoken bundles. I went to the, well, I think can I have a? Now, here are some examples of written bundles as a result of, on the other hand, in the next chapter. So just looking at those, even if you don't know grammar, you don't know linguistics, there's something intrinsically different about these 2 sets of bundles that happen frequently in speech and frequently in writing. And I can imagine, you know, so if I think, can I have a, that kind of goes back to the communicative approach, right? Because we do that. We see these in phrase books of, can I have a coffee? Can I have tea? Can I have a biscuit? So, but you would, as a result of or in the next chapter, those are complete phrases. So let's look at how we can use some of this information to inform our instruction. So here are some really typical spoken bundles. I didn't do this research. I went and I looked in the Longman Grammar and I pulled these out. And so I wanted to group them in a meaningful way. So here are some yes/no question starter bundles. Do you know what? Do you want to? Do you want the? Do you have to? Can I have a? And here's some WH ones. What are you doing? I want to know. What are you doing? What do you call? And that's a great one to know if you're trying to learn vocabulary in another language. What do you call? And you point at something, right? Or how do you spell? Or how do you know? So we have these lists of different types of starter bundles. What could we do with them? Well, one thing you could do in a language classroom is you could give students cards with 1 or 2 question bundles and give them time to come up with other questions. We're using those bundles actually to form full sentences, and then have students go around. So we're not just going to stop with, I made this list of questions, but you're actually going to go around, have the students interacting with each other. There's a concept. And discussing the questions and responses as a class. When I asked this question, I got these answers typically, or I got these types of, I made this question with, do you want to, and somebody else made this type of question. So you hear different types of questions also, and you're using the language. You could also have students listen to a conversation, going back to kind of an audiolingual method, if you will. So we don't want to throw out all the stuff that these different approaches gave us. So we could have students listen to the conversation twice and try to pick out the bundles that they hear. And then you pass out a script and have them check if they could do it. You could also have students create and provide a role play for the conversation, maybe even perform it for the class. This incorporates some pronunciation into using these bundles, and just another way to practice. Look at these common written bundles. As we look at these, we also notice there are tons of prepositions, lots of prepositions. And again, prepositions are something that are very difficult for English language learners. Some languages have them, some languages don't. Some languages have postposition instead of preposition. So, and also they're just sort of idiosyncratic. They don't always make sense. But in this case, this is an example of fixed expressions. These lexical bundles, you don't say on the case at, you say in the case of. And we could stay and say, okay, well, here's a list, memorize this list. But that wouldn't help our students be communicating. But here we can see that these bundles have different discourse functions. We use them to organize discourse. We use on the other hand to show contrast. We use in the case of to sometimes give examples. We have location bundles, the beginning of the chapter, the end of the story, the bottom of the chart. We have framing bundles that help us know as a result of. We know what to expect when we see those. And of course, these also have those prepositions. So it's really important for us to take these chunks of language and help our students know how to use them and show the context where we use them. And so here are some ideas for these written bundles. You can have students find bundles in their class readings. So not necessarily looking at a grammar textbook, but taking this written activity and connecting it to readings and talking about the functions. You can have a text that you've prepared for your students and you switch the bundles around and show how that really impacts the meaning. I think this is something I've done, and it's something that is very, it's dissonant. You're reading this and you're thinking, what? And it just shows the power of that chunk of language and helps students really see how these discourse functions are used to signpost when we write, much like we see signs on the road when you drive or you're traveling somewhere. These bundles guide us. It's also possible to have students look at the text that they've written and try to find bundles and see if they're using these linguistic resources. I know I'm giving you lots of ideas, and that was my goal. So we're going to keep going, and we're going to keep getting lots of ideas. And then at the end, I'm happy to, I will come back and answer any questions that you have. So maybe you have students who are at a lower level. You're teaching more beginning students, and you're going to have them do some readings. And as teachers, we try to pre-teach vocabulary, and we make our best guess. Sometimes have students predict the topic, predict topic from pictures. We have them generate vocabulary. We have them brainstorm. And, one thing you can do is have students, so a lot of what I'm going to tell you, you've done before, but I just think sometimes we forget about these things. I think we forget, oh, I haven't done that activity in a while. So we can put students in groups of 2 to 4 and give them copies of a reading where the paragraphs have been cut up, or if it's a lower level group of learners, you could have a paragraph and you have the sentences, or if it's super low, you could have sentences where the words are cut up, and have students put that back together and have them discuss what helped them put things back together. And I think it's really important to create an atmosphere in your classroom where students are talking about language. So just, you notice they didn't just put the sentences or the paragraphs back together. They talked about what helped them know how to put those back together to create meaning. I also think it's fun in classes to have competitions. And so you can put students in teams and have them racing to put the text back together. It energizes your classroom. It can be more fun. So how do you know what to pre-teach though? Many times we're just sort of saying, okay, well, I kind of know my students. I've had them in class for 5 weeks. I have a pretty good sense of what they know. But we can use some programs. 𝗟𝗃 is a free program. You could use Wordsmith also. We have Mr. Wordsmith with us. And 𝗟𝗃 is free, and it does lots of things. So you can look at 𝗟𝗃, or just Google it. I gave you this reference. And you can use this to take a class reading and create a word list. So you can take the reading and you can use 𝗟𝗃 to give you a word list, or Wordsmith to give you a word list. Save it in Word or Excel. And then what I like to do is I take out the function words. So I take out the words like the, and all those pesky prepositions. This is an example of what I've done with a reading based on the Grand Canyon. So we were doing a geology unit, and I put these high frequency words into the program. I pulled them out. I took reading into the program. I pulled these words that were high frequency out of the reading, and I put them here, and I can give them to my students, and I can ask them, highlight words that you think you know or you don't know. And highlight words you think you don't know or you're not sure of their meaning. So in this case, students were highlighting organisms, sediment, erosion, carbon. And that way, right away as a teacher, I can look and see, oh, lots of yellow markers, they're unsure of this meaning. So they're using highlighters, yellow and red. And if I see a lot of red, I know, oh, I should really pre-teach these words. So I'm not guessing about what my students know. If I see a lot of yellow words highlighted in yellow, I can have students work in groups to teach each other these words. But I also want to show you an example of taking some of these computer tools, if we have the readings electronically, and we can create these lists to be able to pre-teach vocabulary, to know what we need to pre-teach, so we're maximizing our classroom time. And we can pick a word like erosion, and we can show this word in context. So these are keyword in context, and you'll notice erosion is nicely lined up there in the center. The other thing that you might notice here is that erosion happens with deposition. So my background's in geology, and we have this notion that if something's getting eroded, it's getting put somewhere else. So it doesn't just disappear. And so this is another example of teaching chunks of language. These aren't lexical bundles necessarily, but they have strong co-occurrence. We have something that if we're talking about deposition, we're going to talk about erosion, we're going to talk about weathering. This is a way to make teaching more effective, and also to give our students not only words, but the concepts that go with them. And I know that, this might not be something all of you will want to do, but I think it's really useful for students to see these words in context. It helps them be prepared. It gives them exposure. And then as they meet these words, they'll have greater ease with dealing with new vocabulary. Okay, big breath. Now we're going to look at grammar charts. And you might look at this and think, fun with grammar charts. Ha, that's an oxymoron. Have fun with grammar charts. Well, hopefully you'll see. And so I also realized this is like a whirlwind teaching idea tour. And hopefully you'll come away with something rather than just a frenetic glance at many things. But we'll see. So one of the things that can be fun is to make a copy of the grammar chart that you're teaching or reviewing. Cut the chart into sections, and I'll show you an example in a second. As we know, all grammar charts have rules on one side and the examples on the left side. And many times we just go through these grammar charts. We think, okay, we need to do this. And then we wonder why our students can't apply what we're teaching. It's because we've taught it in such a decontextualized manner. So you can cut up this grammar chart, and as students come into class, you just hand them a piece of the chart. And when the class begins, the student has to find their partner in the chart. And now they are the experts. So for example, here with plural nouns, I would cut this chart up like this, and I would give a student coming into the room this part, and then maybe another student coming in, and then they have to find each other. And that way, you've gone over the content in the chart. You've got people who are experts. This is a pretty basic chart of just plural nouns, but still, if you're teaching plural nouns, this could be a better way to go through the grammar chart rather than having students just look at this and then go on and never contextualize it. You can also, instead of going through the examples, give the students the rule side. If this is a review, you might have them have the rule side, the left side, and have them find examples out of their textbooks, out of their writing, out of their readings, so that it's, again, contextualizing this grammar chart and not just leaving it as this weird thing in your book. You can also give students, if you have a more advanced class, you could give them the example and then have them try to find the rule or infer the rule or create the rule. And of course, then you also want to check that they're actually creating the correct rule. We'll look a little bit at mistakes in editing. A personal grammar log is a really good thing to have your students do when they have trouble with a particular feature. Not all of our students have faced the same challenges. So having students, in addition to having a vocabulary notebook, you might also want them to have a grammar log. We're going to talk about being language detectives. So the personal grammar log is much like a vocabulary journal, and it's a nice way to keep useful examples. And I think that many of us, as we learn a language, we have some things that we find particularly challenging. And if you have that written down, you can go back, you can look at it. Maybe you're on the bus on the way to school or the train, you can go over it. I also think it's a good way to right the wrongs, to take something that's incorrect and correct it. So if you give writing feedback, this can be very useful. So you can have language detectives, what I'm going to call inside the classroom. This is something that the public schools in the US did for quite a while, where they would take, well, we're going to talk about outside the classroom too, but inside the classroom, you put a chunk of language on the board that comes from errors that your students are struggling with. So you might have something, yesterday I finished all my homework. It's hard to say that wrong. And Tom is study. So the students come in, they see this on the board, they come in and they fix it. So they have their own little personal grammar log. They fix that error. You can also do this where students bring the error in, especially in this age of cell phones where it's so easy to take a photo. So the students bring the, quote, criminal in. And for example, this is something that you see quite often, the apostrophe S. So we've got tips. There was a coffee place near the campus in Flagstaff, and one of my students went in and said, "Oh, does someone named Tip work here?" And the person at the coffee bar had no clue what they were talking about. They're like, "No, they must work somewhere else." And so you can see that even native speakers struggle with this. I've seen this in the grocery store with tomatoes instead of plural. Somebody owns those. And then I had thought about applying at a university that had this sign on the entrance door. The door is broke. decided that I didn't need to apply to that university. So I think this is something that you can have the students bring in, they talk about it, talk about why it's wrong, and then you can have this wall with the photos or the examples of it. And I think this also reinforces that even if you're in an English speaking or an English dominant environment, that you'll see mistakes. English speakers, just because someone's a native speaker of a language, of any language, it doesn't mean that they're perfect. Okay, one more activity about writing feedback, and then we will move on to questions, and I'll leave some time for that. But I want to show you, many of us who teach writing spend a lot of time giving feedback, and we want, in my opinion, we want to be able to have our learners be more autonomous. And so I'm going to give you some ideas that hopefully will be helpful to you. So this is a website. Some of you might be familiar with 𝗂𝗂𝗃, Mark Davies' site with the corpus of contemporary American English. This is a subset of 𝗂𝗂𝗃 that focuses on the academic portion of it. And you know, everything has its flaws, but this is a tremendous resource for us as teachers. We can see here that you have a frequency list, and you have this chart that shows up on the left-hand side when you go to that, and it's going to have different words. If you ever teach this in a class, know that not all your students will have the same words, and help them understand that, again, this is showing you the frequencies, where the words are most common, which registers. So we can see that administrator happens a lot in academic language, but not so frequent in fiction or spoken language. So the idea here is that you can input and analyze texts. So if you click on that input and analyze texts, you come to this, and you see that there's a box on the left side of the screen that says samples. It has a drop-down menu. So you can use some of the samples that are already in there, or you can actually put in your own sample. So I put in an example here of part of a paper that a student had written. We see that on the left-hand side. And then you see these words in color on the on the right-hand side. They're organized into bands. I don't think that that's very useful for us, but what I do like very much is that we can take this text that's here, and we can click on any word on the right-hand side. And in this case, I've clicked on the word resources, and this shows us right away the register. Remember, I kept talking about register being really important, that we use words differently in different goals, in different language functions. So here we see that resources is a good academic word. That's really nice. But even more so, we can see almost like a little vocabulary toolkit, a collocation. So when we look at this word resources, we can see adjectives that frequently go with resources. We can see human resources, financial resources, economic resources. We can see nouns that co-occur frequently. We can see resource management, resource department, energy resources. We can see that these words go together. We can also then look at the verbs that are associated with resources, and we can see this, I think, gives us a better sense as a language learner and as a language user. We can look at these verbs and we can see we provide resources, we develop resources, we protect resources, we manage resources. And this kind of gives us a sense that we see resources as something valuable. So this can be really useful for students as they are trying to develop their vocabulary and also fine-tune their use of language. So this, I show students how to use this, but I also want to make my job as a writing teacher easier to give feedback and also to encourage my students to be autonomous. So after I've taught them how to do this, I can take examples from their writing. So let's say that a student had written a paper about natural disasters. It seems like that's something that's really common right now in the world, unfortunately. Not only natural disasters, lots of violence, but we can see that in this case, the student had written a paper about some hurricanes and tornadoes and said they caused big damage. Well, I understood what the student meant, but I wanted them to understand that there were different adjectives, different intensifiers for the word damage. And so I just highlight damage in their paper, and they know to go to word and phrase, put the word damage in, and then look at what happens with the noun damage. And so we see that we could have serious damage, permanent damage, severe damage. So this gives the student more choices, more adjective choices that are more accurate and more precise. And that's what we want to be able to do in writing. We can also, in this sense, it was a matter of just expanding vocabulary and giving a student more precise choices. It can also be the case where a student has written something like, she is a notorious scholar. And as native speakers of English, we think, well, that's a kind of an odd collocation. That's an odd grouping because we don't use notorious in that sense. So again, I can highlight notorious and we can look down here and we can see as we go to this little, as I like to call it, a vocabulary toolkit for this word, we can see that notorious is often used in cases of prison, murder, drug, killer, criminal, terrorist. So not a happy word. We call that the semantic prosody. The flavor of that word is not a happy word. So the student might want to go back and revise this and not say she is a notorious scholar. I didn't tell the student, change the adjective with damage. I didn't tell the student, don't use notorious. I just gave them resources so that they could make more informed choices on their language use. And hopefully, as they move forward as language learners and language users, they have this as a resource that they can continue to look at. So, wrap up. That's what you wanted to hear, right? Wrapping up. Hopefully, you have, in this whirlwind tour, more awareness of the importance of register. Hopefully, you've seen that's highlighted throughout this presentation, even with a simple word like make, and then moving to more refined ideas of how we use big damage or more precise vocabulary. You've seen vocabulary and grammar working together. Hopefully you have some ideas for using chunks of language, not just teaching words in isolation, but actually teaching common collocations or common extended collocations. And you've seen a whirlwind of ideas of resources and activities for hopefully connecting outside of class. So thank you very much, whatever part of the world you're not on. And I hope that one of your thank yous is here. I hope that you don't feel like this right now. And I'll leave you with these references as I look at some of the questions. And there's two websites at the bottom. The one on the left for Grammar and Beyond has a very nice newsletter that has lots of ideas for using language, activities, resources for the classroom, whether you're using that series or not. So